Welcome to the Vinicius Studio podcast, where music, stories, timeless art, and resonant ideas help us live better, think deeper, and feel more alive. Welcome, everybody. This is Vinicius Barbosa Pipa. I'm a composer and songwriter, a professor at Berklee College of Music Online, and an Emmy nominee. Before we begin, I have something to ask of you. Could you please hit subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to this podcast, and then leave me a like, a comment, or a review. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. You know, there's this strange idea out there that old movies are only for film buffs, that if you're just a regular person who enjoys a good story, that you should stick with whatever is new and on Netflix or something like that. And in a way, I get it. It comes from humility, right? We think that these old movies are too slow, they're kind of foreign, they're out of touch, they're too different. But here is the irony. If you actually sit down with one of these films, you'll often find that the storytelling is very clear. The emotions are very direct. The artistry is right there in front of you. It's like hearing from the source itself instead of someone trying to summarize it for you. But the deeper reason to watch old movies is this. Every age has its own blind spots. Today's films reflect our own assumptions, our own obsessions, our own mistakes, our own fights. They can be brilliant, but they're all swimming in the same water that we are, breathing the same air that we are. Old movies come from a different stream. When you only watch what's current, it's like walking into a conversation at 11 o'clock that started at 8. You will miss the context. You won't understand why people are laughing, or why someone's angry, or what really is at stake. When you go back to the classic movies, you get the full conversation. You see the foundations of film language, the cultural assumptions of another era, and the threads that still run into our present stories. So watching old movies gives you perspective, surprises you, and it often reminds us that what it means to be human, to fall in love, to suffer, to laugh, to hope, hasn't really changed that much. So my charge to you is this: go back and watch the old movies. Not like homework, not so that you can sound a little more sophisticated or something like that, but because they are alive, and because in their light, you will see our own age and yourself a lot more clearly. So that's one of my main points here, and one of the main points I would submit to you as a good reason to be watching old movies often. If you're someone who's interested in making movies, but even just as a spectator of movies, you will find your taste, not only for movies, but for so many other things. You will find your taste increasing and broadening and becoming richer if you accustom yourself to those old movies. So maybe a recommendation is, for every few modern movies that you watch, I recommend that you go and watch an old one, right? We can talk about which ones you should watch later on in this episode. So one first question that arises here when we're talking about movies is this: is a movie automatically better because it's old? And the answer is no, obviously. It's not automatically better because it is old. It's not like all of the movies from the past are better than all of the movies from the present. However, one of the things about old movies that are still relevant today is that they were filtered by time. So if you have a selection of movies that are considered greats or classics, and they sort of stood the test of time, they have been filtered and tested by time, right? We can't say the same yet of our modern movies, you know, a great Christopher Nolan movie or a great, more recent Spielberg movie, right? Those movies are relatively young and we still remember them, but we might only remember them because they are recent. Only time will tell, right? Only in 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, if we're still talking about some of the great movies of now, then we can say about them, yes, these movies stood the test of time. We remembered them, and there is something that points to greatness about something standing the test of time. So that's one thing we can definitely say about some of these great old movies, is that they have stood the test of time. And by contrast, the movies from the past that we don't remember, there are plenty of them, those didn't stand the test of time, right? And so those were kind of forgotten and fell by the wayside, and it's usually because they didn't have, this kind of timeless factor to them. Out of curiosity, I went and looked up. I wanted to compare how many movies were being made per year in the 1930s, so each year from the 1930s to the 40s, and in the 2010s to about 2020. I picked these years. Here's why. World War II starts in 39, right? So, of course, from 39 to 45, which is the World War II time, movie production would expectedly decrease. And similarly, in 2020, right? 2020, the pandemic starts, of course, movie production takes a great hit as well. So I didn't want to include those in my assessment. So from 1930s to 1940s, roughly 350 to 400 feature films per year were being made, and plus another 300 kind of low budget films. So that's a total of 600 to 800 movies released yearly. Okay, that's in the 1930s. And then in the 2010s, theatrical releases in the US and Canada averaged 700 to 800 films per year, peaking at 873 in 2018. So it's a similar number, right? 600 to 800 in the 30s and 700 to 900 in the 2010s. The reason I wanted to look that up was, are we making too many movies now? And back then they were making fewer and better movies, and now we're just making throwaway movies. It's not the case, right? The rate is actually pretty similar. So it's interesting to compare, right? Just who's making more movies, but we're kind of in a similar camp here from the past. A next question that pops up is the following. Of those old movies that are classics, right? So those are the old movies that stood the test of time, are still remembered today, and still revered. What makes them so good? What makes the good ones so good? A few thoughts here. I alluded to this already earlier, but old movies exist outside of the framework of our current time, problem, divisions, etc. They were going through entirely different times, different cultural landscape, and so on. So you get to kind of exist outside of our framework, at least for a little bit. So that does make old movies a sort of a window into the past. Now, here's another technical aspect about old movies. It's that old movies had very limited resources, right? These days, it's a lot easier to create visual effects and all kinds of really great cinematic elements when you're putting together a movie. But back in the day, these resources were very, very limited. You know, sound effects, cameras, literally they had fewer opportunities to shoot the various takes within a movie because they had to do it on film. You know, even before the invention of color, you had black and white movies, so they didn't even have the luxury of color. What does that mean? That means that because they had fewer resources, they had to rely on other methods to make their storytelling better. And usually that translated to the writing. So the writing of some of these great movies would be fantastic. So the script would be really good, the story would be fantastic, and the acting as well. So those things you can really lean on those. So it creates a simplified but oftentimes stronger storytelling environment for filmmakers, which is a very interesting consequence. But as any creative would know, sometimes limitations really, really help with your creativity, right? When you eliminate the amount of things that you can do, the amount of directions that you can go, you have to focus on a few things and really perfect them, really craft them very well. That's what happened very often with old movies. A lot of the modern language of film hadn't yet been developed since the art form was so young. So you can notice some exceptional filmmakers like Orson Welles, Hitchcock, Frank Capra. They would start to take stabs at a variety of modern storytelling devices, right? So, you know, in It's a Wonderful Life, the Frank Capra movie, you see, you know, narration over a frozen frame, right? There were not a lot of movies doing that back then, or, you know, long sequences without dialogue that you would see in Vertigo, for example, the Hitchcock movie. Again, they were experimenting with the medium and using it for storytelling in a very fresh way that wasn't yet fatigued, you know, by overuse. none of these things had been used yet. Because remember, when people started making early movies, they kind of functioned like filmed plays. It's only a little bit later into the life of the filmmaking art form that people started using the various elements as storytelling devices. But at first, you set a camera in front of a stage and then you just film a play happening in front of you. But later on, you had people, using the camera to do a close-up or to make half of the shot dark and half of the shot light, right? Or to obscure something in the shot so that you wouldn't see it and then have it be revealed, right? Have the actor stand outside of the spotlight and then walk into the spotlight closer to the camera, for example, right? So these little devices that now we kind of take them for granted when we watch movies, they weren't developed yet, and you can see some of these great filmmakers taking a stab at them and developing them kind of in real time as you watch these old movies. Here's another reason as to why these classic movies are so good. In the past, in the early 1900s, 20s, 30s, 40s, actors and filmmakers, they were usually immersed in a deeper culture than we are. There's just no going around it. They would be very familiar, for example, with classic literature or with classical music or with classic theater, right? And that rich tradition of storytelling, of art making, would inform the way they made movies. So that really built them up to be these very vibrant artists that knew a lot about a variety of different art forms. And then here's something interesting to think about regarding quality. The way to tell that an art form is at its peak is when you look at audience scores and critics' scores, and they match. Does that make sense? So the things that are popular are also the things that are the best. So a good example of that is the year 1942. In 1942, the most popular movie of that year and the most critically acclaimed movie of that year was Casablanca. It was the same movie. The audience and the critics agreed. It's something that you don't see happening a lot these days. Sometimes you do, but not that often. But in 1942, you have that match, right? Critics and audience are in agreement. That's a good way to tell that an art form is at a particularly vibrant phase in its life. So for those of you who are not particularly drawn to watching old movies, I thought I would give you a few tips. It's my helpful guide to you to kind of start getting into old movies if that's not a thing you do normally. Here's the first thing to keep in mind. Watching old movies is an acquired taste. So it will take a little bit of time to get used to them. They run at a different pace than the movies that we watch now do, right? If you're used to watching a lot of modern movies, or God forbid, if you're used to just spending most of your time on Instagram and TikTok, old movies, they have a very different pace. They look different. They feel different, right? Some of the people in it talk differently. So you want to ease yourself into it and be patient with it. If you decide to watch an old movie tonight, let's say, put away your phone, put away the distractions, and see if you can focus on it 100% and just try to accompany the ebbs and flows of the picture to see what it does to you. You have to usually put on, if you're watching, let's say, a movie from the 1940s, you'll probably have to put on your 1940s hat, right? So that means your sensibilities as a modern movie watcher have to be checked out at the door, and you have to sort of pretend as if you were a 1940s viewer watching this movie for the first time. So you need to change your expectations a little bit. I also encourage people to don't give up on the first one. When you start getting into old movies for the first time, again, there may be a little bit of resistance, but I promise you that the reward for training yourself to enjoying watching these old movies, the reward is really, really great. I think like I said earlier in the podcast, it's going to enrich your taste in a variety of things, not just in movies. It will enrich your taste. It may be a gateway to enriching your taste into other things, in old books and old music. If old movies are a gateway to that, let that be the case. Try your best. So don't give up on the first movie. Try to watch a few movies. I'll have some recommendations later in the podcast of places you can start if it's new to you. And then lastly, and as far as tips go, expect something slower. Expect, fewer dopamine hits. Expect more focus on the acting, on the writing, on the plot development, right? Like I was saying earlier, these old movies have fewer resources than we do now. And so the aspects of the movie that really shine are these that I just mentioned. So expect to be wowed by them rather than by, flashy visuals or visual effects or things like that. See if you can lean your focus into those aspects. With all that in mind, I have some recommendations for you all. So one of the best places to start looking for what are some of the best old movies is AFI, the American Film Institute. That's a website that you can look up online. You can just type in on Google American Film Institute. You can go to their website, and then in there you can find lists. Maybe I'll link that in the description here of the podcast. So if you go to these lists that the American Institute makes available, you can see what is sort of considered the canon of the greatest movies or of classics. So that's the place to find it. So that's about it for today, my friends. If you like what you heard, please go ahead and click subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to your podcasts. And if you're looking for a way to support my work, best way to do that is to look me up on Substack. You can find me at musicbyvinicius.substack.com. So that's musicbyvinicius.substack.com. It's free to sign up over there, and you can also support financially if you choose to do so. But that's just a good way to keep up with me, stay in touch, and know when I'm coming out with new podcast episodes or updates on any other projects that I might be working on. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you so very much for listening. I really appreciate your time and your attention, and I hope you're enjoying these podcast episodes. Bye for now.